Sometimes I think the roles that we learn the most from are the ones that are the most challenging for a variety of reasons.
Purposely Podcast, speaking with social entrepreneurs and charity founders and leaders, people who are making the world a better place. Here's your host, Mark Longbottom.
A really warm welcome to Purposely with Maree Sidey, CEO of the Australian Community Foundation. It's a donor-advised fund that's a little bit different to the norm. So instead of being place-based, they cater for all of Australia. Their focus is on activating a nation of givers. We talk about all sorts of topics and issues. Maree is a daughter of a minister. She has a real passion for social justice, which was encouraged when she was younger. She talks about values-based leadership and about bringing your real self to work. A really fascinating conversation, well worth a listen. Can I just ask you, whatever platform you're on, whether you're on Apple Podcasts, whether you're on Spotify, can you please hit follow? It really helps me to get the message out there. Enjoy the episode. This episode of Purposely was brought to you by Benevity, all-in-one software solution that benefits employees, customers, non-profits, and society. Let's get back to the show. Maree Sidey, a really warm welcome to Purposely Podcast.
Thank you so much, Mark. Lovely to be here. Been really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. You're the CEO of Australian Community Foundation. What's its mission? What's its purpose?
So we're what's called Intermediary Foundation, and we're here to support people with or organisations who want to be philanthropic, which means that we support people to set up a fund or a foundation with us, and they can go about their giving journey with us. And the overall mission of the foundation is a fairer Australia.
So a donor-advised fund?
Yeah, donor-advised funds is what they're commonly known about in the US, and which means essentially if you're in a privileged position to be able to give through fortunate circumstances in your life, you can set up a fund and then we help you achieve your giving ambitions.
Now, I really want to go into a bit of the history of it. Before we go into that, just checking on the sort of size and scale of it. So you guys are based in Melbourne, broadly 30 employees. You got a team based down there. Tell us a bit about the setup of it.
Yeah, so our head office is in Melbourne. We're unusually for community foundations, we're a national foundation, and we're essentially what we call an issues-based national foundation. So donors set up a fund with us. We talk to them about what their interests are and what sort of philanthropy they'd like to achieve or giving. We usually use the term giving, and we can have a conversation about that because it's just much more accessible as a term. And then people give either in Australia or overseas to their interest areas. And then we have a few areas as a foundation that we really focus and organise giving around, and that's sort of environment and democracy, inequality and First Nations self-determination.
How much of it is, because donor advisors we just discussed, how much of it is sort of listening to the donor and doing exactly what they say versus guiding them and supporting and assisting them about what topics or what issues or what causes they fund?
Yeah, great question. So philanthropy at its heart is about the individual or the family or the organisation for when we're talking about corporate philanthropy and what you stand for and what your values are. So it's got to start with your own values, your own interests, your family history, what motivates you and or your children or your workplace and your colleagues. So it definitely starts with the donor, and then when the foundation comes in, because we're sort of a very values-led foundation, so we tend to attract donors that are really focused on social justice and environmental justice. So do your own giving and do your own giving within an environment that speaks to your values.
Yeah, and you are unique. So 100 million broadly is your funds under management or endowment. That's about the scale of it?
I'm a CEO, so I tend to round up, but it's sort of around 150 mil. It grows by about 20 to 30 mil every year. We bring in about 100 new funds every year. And then we have a range of private clients. So it's sort of a really amazing organisation in that it speaks to the generosity of Australians, in that we regularly attract people and organisations who want to be philanthropic.
Yeah. And one thing that jumped out at me was the move in 2018. You guys decided to go fully around responsible investment and divested the then 90 million by the look of it and really shift it towards investment for good. Tell us a bit about that decision, because I imagine that seems like a great decision, but imagine it was a tough one.
Yeah, such a powerful move. And we were one of the early foundations in Australia that really moved strongly into the responsible investing space. It actually started in 2015, Mark, when we had a group of donors who were very focused on the environment come to us and say, this is really important to us and we think the foundation needs to be a leader in this space. So that allowed us to essentially look closely at our investments and make sure that we weren't investing in anything that was causing harm. And then we went on a journey to be much more proactive than that and bring in a sort of a full responsible investing policy. And that means that we're now beyond just making sure that we're not in anything harmful or negative. We're actually contributing to positive outcomes for people and the planet. And, we're really proud of that and have been strongly supported by our donor community around that.
Real alignment with your mission. But I imagine at the time there was opposition and there were people talking about trade-offs. How much opposition did you face?
I actually think in hindsight, and I've since had some of our core and heartland and long-term supporters come to me and say it actually was the other way, that if we hadn't moved, we would have lost our heartland environmental donors. So we were in a position of needing to take that move. But we certainly had, I remember one morning was probably an amazing I'll never forget it in my CEO journey. I had someone come into my office who had a fund with us and sat down and had a conversation and said, look, I don't support this approach. And it turned out that that person had a strong career and history in the fossil fuel industry. And I found out later on that we lost a $30 million bequest from that individual. And, that was a real test of leadership for our foundation and our board. And the immediate response was, well, we might have lost one potential bequest, but imagine how much more support we'll gain and from future generations and younger donors by taking this stand. And I think times like that is when your leadership and your sense of commitment to a decision like that really is affirmed.
Yeah.
And you think, oh my goodness.
Yeah, definitely. And looking back at the past, and because a lot of community foundations, it's a North American concept originally, but it's often around place-based giving. But your organization is all of Australia, so people can give through you to causes all across Australia. Let's go back to the mid-90s when it was formed. So the founders were Marion and Webster, who my path has come across a bit
yes.
when I was CEO of the Auckland Foundation, but Hayden Raysmith was the other. But I believe it started on Marion's kitchen table.
It did. In fact, our office before my time was in Marion's back bedroom for quite a number of years. And that's not uncommon for small and emerging community foundations to be, really volunteer-led, particularly in their early years. And then we emerged into Melbourne Community Foundation and were Melbourne Community Foundation for about the first half of our history. So we're 25 years old now. And then in 2012 or so, our then board made a decision that we were looked at the organisation and realising we're beginning to attract many donors who were outside Victoria even, and we became Australian Communities Foundation, and that was a really, I think, sensible decision, because there's also another really large and well-established foundation in Melbourne, which is Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, and Melbourne didn't need two.
Yeah.
So Australian Communities Foundation was a great move, and since then that decision's been really played out by the amount of donors that we now have right across Australia. And interestingly, the giving has expanded way beyond Victoria. We now give out more outside Victoria than we do in.
Yeah, because there is definitely a place for place-based giving, but then themes or causes that particularly of interest to individuals who want to give, and then they got that freedom with you. And there was I noticed in your history, there was some guidance from Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which I find really interesting. So one of the most successful community foundations of all time. So I think 13.5 billion I read in terms of their total funds under management. But yeah, tell us a bit about their input.
Look, Peter Hero was one of the very early CEOs of Silicon Valley. He's unfortunately passed a few years ago, no longer with us, but he was a fabulous mentor for our foundation and for Hayden and Marion in the early days. And the funds under management, as we call it, so the size of the corpus for some of those large community foundations in the US is sort of eye-watering, and Silicon Valley is certainly one of the largest because it's based in sort of the tech heart of America, and people like Mark Zuckerberg have donor advised funds at Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
So it's just quite amazing to watch the rise of the donor advised fund concept in the US. It's now the fastest growing charitable entity in the US by far. So, and only really emergent in Australia. I'm sure people will be listening to us thinking, I've never heard the term donor advised fund or sub-fund, which is what it's often known as in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it's emergent in New Zealand as well. So we have 17, but it's an alternative for people who don't necessarily have to have the hassle of setting up an independent charity, and then it's tax efficient as well. And it makes sense pooling those funds as well and getting that sort of investable power. All of those things makes it lots of other reasons to be involved in them as well.
Yeah, look, you explain it beautifully, Mark, because I know you've had a background in this space as well, but essentially it is absolutely just a simple alternative to what we call a private foundation in Australia, or a PAF. And it just means that you don't have to set up your own board and invest your own funds, and the grant making and administration happens on your behalf through our foundation.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we now support both. So we also support people who want to set up a private foundation, but our donor advised funds have been our history and where we've come from.
Absolutely. And in terms of you guiding givers and guiding generous people to good causes, like you go above and beyond, like you've just discussed some of them, but I'm thinking around First Nation people and in terms of equity, like assisting people to live a more equitable current and future.
Yes, and being as I call it, a sort of a mission-led or a values-led foundation has been really important, because what it allows us to do is to support people with their own giving journey, and people, can give to, a whole variety of charitable community-based organisations. So they might have an interest in the arts, or they might have an interest in education or democracy, or, animal welfare, you name it. We give out thousands of grants each year on behalf of our donors. And people establish a fund and they name their fund, and then they decide what they want to give to. And we help them with giving inspiration. So we regularly send through emails and coordinate events that support the interests areas of our donors. But then, interestingly, across the top of that, when we became a national foundation about 10 years ago, we also thought it would be really important to have a point of view to help people connect to those big issues in Australia and globally that can often feel really overwhelming if you're trying to tackle them as an individual. So climate change is a great example of that. How does one person, even if you're a Mark Zuckerberg, tackle climate change? Well, the answer is you can't. But when we actually come and give together around some of those really pressing issues, your funds can be pulled together with other people's funds, and all of a sudden we have a lot more power to influence policy. So that's been a really big driver of the work of the foundation for the last half of our history.
Wonderful. And changing tack for a bit, so taking you back a bit, and you've had a phenomenal career. So I've got your career arc as sort of comms, public affairs, then very much into designing programs that are going to support people around all sorts of issues. Amazing. And then very much firmly in philanthropy. And you're on the boards of all Philanthropy Australia. We'll talk about those other non-executive roles that you have. But taking you right back to when you were younger, what was the sort of foundations to your life that led you to purpose and wanting to make a difference? Do you look back at your childhood and think, yeah, there was some influence there about that was going to sort of design my future?
Absolutely. I often talk about sort of that social justice runs through my veins. I'm the daughter of a social worker and a Baptist minister. And, the focus on justice and, equity and who had access to privilege and who didn't, and who was excluded and who has a voice was just really apparent in our family values growing up and the way we viewed the world. So I then followed in the path of my mum, actually, and became a social worker. So I started as a social worker and really quickly developed an interest into what we think about as sort of systems approach to the world. So what's going on? How do we think about all of those things in a systematic way? And how do we actually intervene in the system to make it fairer? And that's really been my entire career focus, whether it's been, in child and family services where I first started, or youth mental health, where I was involved in a range of organisations that really did change the system for the better in Australia for young people who had emerging health issues. And then really interestingly I spent some time in drug and alcohol services thinking about how we run our community sports clubs so that they're more responsible environment before I moved into philanthropy. But the consistent theme all the way through has been sort of social justice.
Yeah. And that social justice conversation in the household with parents, what did that sound and look like? What were the sort of themes? Do you remember it being a conversation around the dinner table?
It definitely was a conversation around the dinner table, but I think it was also just demonstrated by the type of household we were. So it's when you're the family of a Baptist minister, the household is the manse, is the office, is the workplace, is the home, is the family environment. And there are a parade of people that come through, which are people, seeking advice, seeking support. People come through at critical times in their lives, so they might be grieving or be on the cusp of divorce or having issues within their family or their workplace. And I think the church is a really interesting insight into that blend of people's personal and work lives and seeing the intersection there, because there's no distinction in church life. And so that, watching how churches happen and how they operate and what leadership looks like and what authentic leadership looks like, it was just a fabulous growing opportunity for me that I didn't know was happening, that I actually think I draw on more than I realise when I hit tricky times in my own leadership journey. And I'm not necessarily talking about the faith aspect of that sort of the family of origin. I'm really thinking about how churches are sort of, really interesting microorganisms of the larger society.
Absolutely. And were you a confident child? So, leadership is clearly your area of expertise. But back then, would someone have said that Maree is going to be a leader one day?
I was one of those annoying, school captain, elder child, doing the right thing, growing up young person. In fact, I feel like that a lot of my actual growing up happened in my sort of early to sort of late 20s, where I stopped trying to be all of those things and really went on a journey to find out sort of who I was in the world and what I stood for and, what my values were. So, yeah, very interesting, I think, distinction between my early years and then my sort of more adult years.
Yeah, because you went on and did a degree, or a couple of degrees by the look of it. So it looks like you were incredibly driven. You had aspirations and you wanted to, fulfill your full potential. Do you remember that being top of mind and for you?
What a great question. I think people saw confidence and leadership potential in me, and I was one of those lucky people that was often supported and mentored by great people, and I sought that out as well because I definitely was ambitious as a younger person. I think it's interesting to think about in the context of being a young female leader, where those networks aren't always, or certainly when I was coming through, they weren't as obvious or as established as they were for men. So having a good, strong sense of self was really important. And I think that came from my family and my parents and their belief in me. But I think that only takes you so far, I think, as a leader, that sense of external leadership. And I think the last sort of 20 years or so has been much more of a journey around how then I bring my own authentic sense of self to my leadership and share that with others. And I think that's probably a much harder thing to do.
Yeah. And first role in social work or related field. So was that with Berry Street? Was that your first role?
It was Berry Street, out of home care. So working with young people who couldn't live with their families and for reasons that were often really traumatic for both the family and for the young person. So you'll hear the tremor in my voice. I often think back to those times as really, for a young social worker, that's often where we start, and they can be really hard jobs with very few wins. But I do hold on to a couple of young people that I think about still to this day, where we were able to make a real difference to their lives, and think, well, sometimes that's what you take away from those really hard jobs was, are there one or two people whose lives will be changed because of it?
Yeah. And myself, I worked in a HIV hospice at a relatively young age. And when I look back now, it actually was probably almost too much too soon in some ways. So I was around palliative care and end of life stuff. And I look back at how, not at the time, but just after that experience, sort of how I reacted. When you look back being around prevention of violence or being around those sort of issues, do you think it sort of shaped a bit about how you were and how did you protect yourself being relatively young and confronted with those issues?
Yeah, I often think back to think how far we've come in some ways for recognising sort of stress in the workplace and what we put young people into, the situations we put young people into, dealing with a really serious amount of trauma and also having to make very tough decisions that are where they're often the right decision or the is not particularly obvious, or there may not be an actual decision where there's a particular positive outcome. And I don't think that that's just the same for social work. I sort of think of the police force, I think of the armed services, I think of the emergency response services, those really high stress on-call jobs where you're dealing with people at critical points of their lives in major trauma. I'm really pleased that we recognise that more now, but, I'm sure that that's certainly an area that we still need to keep a watchful eye on for our young people when they go into those roles.
Absolutely. And back to your career in terms of that career arc I was talking about. So combining sort of, which is a rare combination of social work, communications, public affairs. What do you think when you look back at the role that sort of stands out the most to you and you really felt like you hit your straps or you did your best work or dominated your thinking?
Really interesting to think about. Sometimes I think the roles that we learn the most from are the ones that are the most challenging for a variety of reasons. And the sort of move from social work into communications and public relations really came about through a bridging role or a couple of bridging roles, which was around health promotion. And health promotion is all about how, in its bigger sense, is how you influence the public to make a change in their behaviour. And when I got involved in youth mental health, it was pre the time of Beyond Blue and pre the time of Headspace, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is a sort of a big national youth mental health charity that we helped establish. And there was still a lot of stigma around people coming out, particularly in the public domain, and talking about having mental health issues. And so I became really fascinated with that area of work and worked for a fabulous pioneer in that space called Professor Patrick McGorry, who's known to many people in Australia and internationally, who really paved the way of destigmatising young people who are experiencing early stages psychosis. And then convinced the government, together with a number of other peers of his time, to establish this service called Headspace for young people who were experiencing early onset of mental health issues. And his argument was that we do young people an incredible disservice when we have a sort of a 0 to 18 approach, and then adult mental health services kick in at 18 plus, because most mental health issues appear between 15 and 25, and then we have this service system that cuts people off or moves them from one system to another at a really critical time. So I was privileged enough to work with Pat and many of his peers just at the point of setting up this amazing entity called Headspace. And that's changed the landscape of mental health services in Australia, where we now have Headspace centres around the country that look after young people from 15 to 25. And I was there right at the beginning where we sort of sat in a room with a team of just 3 or 4 of us, and the government had given the tender to Origin Youth Health and a range of others to set up Headspace, and we were looked at each other and said, how are we going to do this thing? How are we going to establish a service that doesn't exist and make it national and really get out there and create a health brand that's going to appeal to young people? And that was the role that I really look at, and I look at the Headspace brand to this day, which still exists, which for those of who know it is this sort of green head with a white outline, and think, wow, I was a part of that. It was amazing, but really hard as well.
And in terms of your life journey, so this is, from what I could tell from my research, is you're a young parent at this point, and
I was,
so focusing on and passionate about young people's mental health was relevant because you had children at home and you cared.
Yes, I've got 3, and I had my 2 eldest during that time, and they're now teenagers. So I have a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old, and an 8-year-old, and I look at my 17-year-old and 15-year-old and think, wow, that work really makes a difference to them, their peers. But the other thing that's really shifted is which has just been amazing, is the comfort that generation have now in talking about and identifying when they are struggling or when they have not just mental health issues, sort of a range of issues that might be challenges in their life, and the courage they have to talk about it, not just to their peers, but to their sort of in their school environments and in the public domain, and think, wow, how far we've come and how amazing that is.
And looking back, why do you think young people and young people's mental health and their lives, why do you think that resonated with you personally? Because it's clearly been a thread throughout the early part of your career and still is, but why do you think it particularly resonated?
I think it's because if you can get in particularly with children and young people, no matter whether you're thinking about education or mental health or even social activities or sport, you can really help change the trajectory of someone's life. And also, particularly when we're thinking about young people who come from difficult circumstances or don't have as much privilege, getting into an environment where they just have someone who believes in them, or a sports coach or a teacher or a counsellor or whatever it is, one person can make a huge difference in outcomes. And you see this over and over again, and you look at people who are established leaders in different sectors, and when you listen to them tell their life story, often they will identify that person who believed in me, or I was given a scholarship at a critical point of time. I think that's the answer. You can make a difference.
Because you were building a program when some of the stuff you just described wasn't as the norm, like being able to talk freely about your mental health and it not providing stigma, but trying to future gaze, look into the future, but also know that a service would be required where there weren't services. And love what you said around the hard, like when you get to 15, you're thrown into the adult world, adult health, adult provision. But yeah, like was it challenging at the time trying to take people with you and being sort of gazing into the future about what would be needed and how this would survive?
It certainly was, and I think any startup is. And, I'm a big lover of startup podcasts. I listen to them all the time because I'm always amazed at how much people who are visionaries can achieve. And we certainly had, I've talked about Pat McGorry, but there were many others who were visionaries and were able to convince, government and others to invest in this concept. So you need those pioneers. You also need the people who can come in behind them, because they're not often the people, the visionaries aren't always the people who can, make the change behind the scenes. So you then need the people who can then build the concept out. And then obviously in health, you're talking, it's a highly, funds are scarce. Making a case for a new intervention is really tough with government. And so then you have to prove the concept. So it has to be really evidence-based. And there's a lot of scrutiny. And it's a tough reality of any kind of social service system, but particularly health, when funds go in one direction, because of the limited public purse, they're often seen to be taken from another. And, that's a really tough decision for not just public policymakers, but also for the people who work in different sectors to be allowed a voice and advocate for the cause that they're trying to achieve change in.
Yeah. And your move away from being more, designing programs, being more, I say more at the coalface into philanthropy, was that sort of a creeping thing that happened for you? How did it happen?
No, it wasn't at all. In fact, it was a really fortuitous career opportunity. It came up to take up this role as head of Australian Communities Foundation. And it wasn't the deliberate move into philanthropy. It was actually much more of I really like what this foundation stands for. It fits with my value set. I think the work's really interesting. I can do something useful here. And found myself in this what I call a weird world of philanthropy, because it's a really niche sector and it's quite a privileged sector where you're talking about people who have wealth trying to think through thoughtfully how they're going to use that. I think I fell into philanthropy and have spent the last 8 years or so, I think, in a role which really suits my skill set because of that, the foundation and its focus on social justice.
Did you apply for the role?
I did, yeah. I applied for the role. It was my first CEO gig, and they took a chance on a sort of a young female leader. And I was able to convince them somehow that they should take a chance on me, and they saw something. I suspect it was, a combination of burning ambition and desperation and sort of slight crazy light in my eye. and then they took the chance.
I always think with community foundations, they're confusing to the sort of common eye. So I think because they stand next to, they're a funder, community foundations, they're a funder or a donor advised fund, but they're also, in a sense, not raising funds, but attracting funds to add to their stable. When you went into that role, did you know much about community foundations at that point or DAFs?
No, I didn't at all. And in fact, they're really hard to understand from the outside, which I think is one of the challenges of our sector.
They are, right?
Yeah, they are. And you know that firsthand. So the short answer is no, I didn't. And the complexity of a community foundation is part of its challenge. But I think really simply the way I like to explain it is that we just support people who want to give, and often overlay that with we support, people with privilege who have a social conscience who want to give. And that's us at our simplest.
Like, let's think back to your conversation with the trustees. Do you remember you were clearly aligned on values? Great. But were you aligned on the growth that they wanted you to see under your leadership? Like, do you remember what the total fund was at the point you joined?
Yeah, it was around 60 mil. So we've more than doubled it now. And I think what the board were looking for was, someone who had a really strong strategic vision for where the organisation could go. And what was really interesting, and I think probably just a great fortuitous match, was that I could bring my sort of communications, public relations, but also my social justice, social work experience into a role. And I think into this role. And I think the other thing that was probably attractive to the board at the time was the 20 years in the nonprofit space. And so that's so important when we're sort of influencing, the giving out of money to great change makers and community-based organisations and charitable organisations and leaders doing great work, having your own experience of what it's like to be working and heading up a charity is invaluable.
Yeah.
So I think that really has stood me in good stead.
Doubling the organisation or doubling the funds is wonderful. When you go back to the early strategy, did you do the sort of 100 days, listen, learn, and then launch the Maree Sidey? This is the way the future's going to be? Like,
I hate the 100-day question. I often say to people I recruit, don't give me the 100 days. Tell me what you're going to do in the first 6 months and tell me how you're going to approach it. I probably did the 100 days. I wouldn't do it now because I think the thing that you should do in the first 100 days is just listen and learn and ask great questions and try to have as few fixed opinions as possible and try and stay open. It's so easy, I think, to go in and say, well, I have this experience and knowledge from these other places that I'm going to impart here. So that's I think a common mistake we make as leaders, which I try not to do now, but I probably did, Mark.
Yeah. I'm thinking strategy on a page. Like, can you give us a quick rundown of what that successful strategy looked like? Like
for Australian Communities Foundation?
Yeah, for doubling it and having so much success.
Look, I think like any strategic leadership role, any organisation, any for-purpose organisation, it's got to come back to what do we stand for and how do we express that really clearly to the people we support, so the clients we support, which in our case we call donors, and to attract more, but also the staff who do the work and the organisations that are the recipients at the other end. So what I did was come in and have lots of conversations with people who'd been in and around the organisation for a very long time and said, what do you think Australian Communities Foundation is about? And they said, well, we think it's a foundation that really stands for a fairer Australia. And so we made that. We brought those values front and centre and we made them really explicit. And that, I think, more than anything has been the key to the success because it put out a lighthouse then for other people like-minded people to find us. So that's the kind of easy bit. And then the challenge is then how do you live that? How do you make it authentic? How does it show up in everything you do? How can your staff call you on it? Or how can your donors or stakeholders call you on it as a foundation if you're not being true? So that's the then flip side of that challenge for purpose organisations and for corporates who are wanting to be much more values-led. You've got to build in that authenticity at every level. So I don't know that is what people often like to hear in terms of the secret to success for growth, but that's the thing that I really point to as the number one that has to happen. And then you find great people to bring onto your team and you look after them and then they represent your values and your brand. And that's how we grew. And that is still how we grow.
Mm. And that relationship between the board and the day-to-day people, the executive team, hugely important, I imagine, when you're on a growth agenda, right? You're trying to spread the word across. And you've got to bridge that gap between, we just discussed then, around people not necessarily understanding what a community foundation is or what role it has and what value it can add. Are there things that you did, like I'm assuming you did a whole lot of thought leadership and then you also got in front of people and had a load of coffees. Then you did a whole lot of networking across various communities. But in terms of the mechanics of, getting in front of people, was there anything that you could offer in terms of, God, I'm really glad we did that, or this is really important?
One of the ways we describe our work is that we're a broker between people who want to give and people who are doing great work in the community. And so one of the key ingredients for success have been going out and finding those great, what I like to call change makers, and profiling their work and putting philanthropists or givers in the room with the change makers and setting up a situation where they can talk honestly about the challenges of being the leader of a for-purpose organisation and the barriers they face and the difficulties that they encounter. And, and that can be anything, when you're talking about running a charitable organisation in the community, that can be anything from like, we're just really small and emergent and don't have enough funds to sort of keep the lights on, through to we're a big multinational INGO, which stands for International Non-Government Organisation, and our task is to sort of have a strong culture and brand in Australia. So there's a huge spectrum of leaders out there doing amazing work, and the key to success for unlocking philanthropic funds for them is to put the people who can give in the room with those fabulous leaders and let them hear from them. And it opens up this amazing world to people who are philanthropists, and it allows them to think about, my potentially modest funds or my sort of large amount I have to give can really make a difference if I support this leader in this way. So I think that's a really long way of saying we often, instead of looking at the organisation, we often say, what's the leader doing and how are they working? And what do they want to achieve and what's their vision. And it's no different for our foundation than it is for the foundations that we support. There's got to be a strong, articulate, clear, well thought through vision.
Yeah. And reflecting on you a bit more, and how much has the work you've been doing over the last few decades, how much has it changed you and shaped you?
A lot, I think. I'm continually surprised by the generosity of Australians. I think we don't think about ourselves necessarily as a giving nation. I mean, we often have the cultural cringe in many areas as Australians, but particularly in philanthropy, we look to the US and say, wow, they've got such a strong giving culture and, really large established alumni connected to everything from their hospitals to their universities through to charitable organisations. But what I found with Australians is that I think our culture is just as strong of giving, but we do it differently. We're often a lot less public about it. And that can be hard then to encourage a culture of giving, because that often comes from peer to peer. People talk about to encourage others. It's important to be talking about why you give and who you give to and why you support a particular organisation or why you're passionate about a particular cause. So that can be the challenge for Australians. But having said all of that, every day in my job, I meet people, ordinary Australians who might have more money than they need to live on, and they want to be generous with it. And that just continually astounds me, and such a privilege of the role to interact with people all the time who are being thoughtful about their lives and making a difference. And that's changed me. To answer your question, that's changed me because, it's meant that I now think about, well, what am I doing in my family and how am I teaching my kids the importance of thinking beyond themselves, and how are we creating that culture of understanding if we're fortunate, then what are we doing and what difference can we make? So that's, I think, been the really big difference.
And being a leader in your, professional life, your voluntary life, and then being, a leader at home with children, what sort of score would the kids give you on a 1 out of 10 for leadership? Or how would they describe you?
Teenagers
as a
can
mum?
be harsh. They definitely don't. They definitely call out the sort of, don't CEO me. So they know if
Love that.
I know if they think I'm bringing the sort of boss stuff home. So they call that pretty quickly, and are able to sort of bring me down a peg or two, as teenagers are brilliant at doing. But I think, interestingly, they also observe more than we think about work. So I've noticed that as they've gotten older and more interested in thinking about where their own sort of lives are going to take them, that, really interesting questions come out around. So, what do you do in this situation, and how do you look after your staff? Or, COVID was fascinating for, I think, giving kids of all ages an insight into their parents' lives, their parents' work lives. They suddenly became really transparent. They'd listen in on meetings or they'd hear things going on. And so it started a whole lot more questions and I think even accountability. Do you think you did that well, Mum? Or, wow, that sounded like a tough conversation. That's been a fascinating change, I think, through recent times.
Absolutely. And the thing, the generation you and I bring up, because we've got similar age children, does it feel different to you? Like looking down as a parent or across as a parent, do they act different? Their values a bit different? Their worldviews a bit different?
Yes, I think this generation doesn't get the credit it often deserves for being, a generation that's bearing a lot of burden in a critical point in history for, decisions that were made way before their time. And so they're coming of age in a time where they've got a legacy, which is a really big burden when we think particularly around the climate. And they've looked at our older generations and made really they have really clear-eyed views of what we've done well and what we haven't done well and what previous generations before us, the mistakes that have been made. But also they're really great culture holders of shifts that have been made around in a whole range of areas. We talked about mental health, but I think particularly about gender fluidity is a great example now of young people where gender is, really recognised as much more of a construct and not a fixed thing that, our older generations can find hard to get their head around. And, we think about the emergence of the LGBTQI plus community and the challenges they face. For many people of teenagers now, being gay is such a non-issue. And then beyond that, being non-binary is a non-issue and being trans is a non-issue. And, coming from the intersex community is a non-issue. And so I think we need to be cautious as a sort of an older generation that we don't carry baggage on behalf of this generation coming through that doesn't exist for them. And certainly seen that in my own family. I have a trans daughter, and her journey has been so inspiring. And she's obviously is comfortable with me talking about her journey in this context, and I have permission to do that. But when I think about her journey, and she talked to us about being trans probably about 3 years ago now, and so she was in the middle of her high school years. And what I found completely fascinating is that for her friends and her peers, it was just a non-issue. And so we might have had all these fears about being bullied or being stigmatised or, and I certainly don't want to minimise the tough journey that trans people have to go on. It's incredibly challenging, but there's a very big generational change going on out there, and I find that really inspiring.
Yeah. When your daughter told you this and your own journey with it, did you remember really struggling with the concept at first? And when you explored your own emotions and feelings, and you talked about fear just then, being fearful, what did you do internally on that?
Wow. I think what you do internally and what you do externally is a great question. So, because they're really important differences. So our young person did it in a very teenage way and stood up at the dinner table one day and just said, "I have an announcement to make, I'm trans," and did the mic drop and sort of left us to absorb the announcement, which was clearly, had been building for her for some time, and that she needed to find a way to tell us. And we then went into, clearly she felt comfortable in our family environment that this was going to be supported and well received, and it was. But we certainly had to be really careful of monitoring our own internal emotions around that, and then, making it very clear about what we needed to say to her, and to make sure that she knew we were 100% supportive. Because, when you talk to parents of trans young people and grandparents and siblings and aunties and uncle, one of the key things that people talk about is just the grief, because you grieve for the gender of the young person that you knew, and the construct and the way that you had related to them, and you need to let that go and then embrace what it is that your young person's bringing to you. But there's no other word for it than grief, and that's your journey. And so my key learning from it is that that's something that as parents and grandparents and family members is something that's on you to work through and on us to work through, and really important that if I can share anything from my journey, that's not put on your own young person in their lives, because they've got enough to work through. So that's kind of my reflection on how we managed it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of hate out there. But you and I talked before this episode, and you said actually your daughter's protected from that. The circle she works in, that you talked about generational differences and opinions about stuff. But do you find yourself getting really wound up, protective, reactionary? How does it play out for you? All of the stuff that's been narrated at the moment in public.
Yeah, look, it's not an ideal point in time to understatement to have sort of someone close to you that you really care about on a journey around transitioning, because it's not a safe space in the public domain, and that's become particularly apparent in recent years in Australia, where for whatever reason, known only to our, politicians, have decided to use it as a bit of a political football and a way of drawing a wedge between part of the conservative elements in Australia. And so the people who have been at the other end of that are our trans young people who have been the topic of lots of vitriol or bearing the brunt of vitriol, from everything of, can trans young people participate in sport? Can professional athletes participate in professional sport, through to can we discriminate against young people in our schools on the basis of sexuality and gender? All of those discussions, if they're not managed in a way that is respectful, can have real world consequences for our young people. And just to give listeners an example, the suicide rate amongst LGBTQI plus young people is really high. And then when you think about trans and intersex young people, it's exponentially high. So what can happen is, articles in papers, politicians talking not very thoughtfully, and means that people in general public feel like they have the license to be unthoughtful or cruel or discriminating, and that can mean that we lose young people. People take young people take their own lives because it's just too hard. And so drawing that link for people, I think, is really important, that we're not just talking about a hypothetical here. We're talking about young people who are incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah. It's dehumanizing a lot of that ideology and that stuff, that hateful talk and the sort of binary nature of it, and it has real life implications. You're absolutely right. I mean, as we went to air, if you like, if we just before we record this, a very high profile school in Victoria came under pressure from their church, affiliated church, and saying that they had the right to refuse the choice of a school captain. And that school captain came out and was very open about their sexuality. And one of the things, and this goes back to that generational piece, which I find this quote, I'm going to read you in a second, which I find absolutely superb, which is, and this is from the captain of the school who's been elected, is coming under fire to have his position taken away because of his sexuality. And he talks about the beauty of my generation is its widespread gentle disinterest for sexuality. So that's reframing sexuality in a whole different way and a whole different generation's perspective, that maybe us, if you're Generation X, I certainly am, what we said was important or not important. That makes my heart sing, because that talks to lots of the good stuff that exists out there.
Yes, so I am Gen X and I absolutely love that quote. I just think, what an inspirational young person that goes straight to the heart of what I was trying to say much less articulately before, which is that, we shouldn't obsess and it doesn't matter. And there's a big generational divide on this issue. And thank goodness this is being demonstrated, because it's, completely irrelevant to who people are in the world. My young person is the same person, and their gender is irrelevant to who they are, what they stand for, how I love them, how they love me, and what they're going to do in the world. It should be completely irrelevant. And it's going to be, it's clearly a challenge for the particular group of schools where this has become an issue. But I think it's also a challenge beyond the faith-based communities. It's a challenge in our workplaces, where we still have not really come to terms with how we manage and support people where there's any sort of difference to do with gender.
Yeah.
So it's as I said before, full credit to that young person. What a powerful piece of just quiet but firm leadership.
Absolutely. And a whole lot of self-awareness in there, right? And just surety about who they are and the fact they're happy with who they are and they're going to stand there firmly. So amazing. As we look towards wrapping up, I just want to get your thoughts on what the future looks like for you and also for your organization. Because we touched on it before, you're on boards, you're on the peak body for the Community Foundation movement, you're on Philanthropy Australia's board. Have I forgotten it? A Centre for Australian Progress as well. Like there's a whole lot of hours of meetings I can see there. And then you've got a day job. And then we've talked about you being a parent. Is there any stuff that you want to do for yourself?
Well, I'm sitting at the moment looking at my chickens wandering around my garden. And
I think we heard one of them as well, which is great.
And I have bees in the background. So I balance my work life with a really, really clear focus on the things that I love, which are sort of gardening and looking after those bees and chickens, much to the amusement of my kids. And so that's what I really care about and how I decompress. I love it because I call them flow tasks. So they're just mindless things that I can do in the background while I'm thinking about many other things. But look, in terms of the organisation and where we're going, there's so much to say. We're part of a sector which is really mindful about how we increase generosity in Australia and how we grow giving, and not just for the sake of growing giving, but for the sake of, there's so much to do out there. And we think from climate change through to First Nations self-determination, the immediate work of this year that we're really heavily involved in and is an amazing piece of leadership from so many, is the work of the Voice to Parliament and the work of the referendum. And this is, in Australia, if this is I think the key challenge that we will face as a nation, that we will be the test of us as a nation, of whether we can show generosity and grace and compassion and reconciliation to our First Nations people and be more whole as a nation if we pass the Voice to Parliament and we look to our friends in New Zealand and the way you've been able to negotiate treaty and bring that fully into your public life. So that is the work of this year, and that is the work of our organisation this year, and working alongside our First Nation leaders. And we really hope, I think, that we see the best of Australians in this referendum this year.
And that, for our international guests, is around effectively changing or amending the Constitution of Australia and focus on a fairer Australia, looking backwards.
Bringing our First Nations people into our Constitution and having a voice to Parliament. And that's going to be, there's been no formal treaty or reconciliation with our First Nations peoples in Australia. And it's just something that needs to happen so we can acknowledge, heal and move forward, and also walk alongside the oldest living culture in the world and draw on that knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah, because I did a sociology degree, and I remember one of the writers, John Pilcher, is a sociologist or a writer in Australia, talking about the impact of laws, all sorts of societal issues on Aboriginal people. And, in terms of imprisonment, how many die in prison, like the sort of social outcomes, alcoholism, all of those things need to be, all of that needs to be acknowledged and reflected in a different kind of Australia in the future.
Yes. I mean, we know the world over, don't we, that, First Nations people, no matter what country they're in, need the opportunity to speak for themselves, to advocate for themselves, to, have self-determination. That's how we change, really woeful outcomes that we see in Australia that we are not proud of. And that's a shameful part of our history. So it'll be really, really interesting test for us as a nation to see whether we can come in behind this national referendum that will happen sometime around September or October. And our First Nations people will have their own voice into our parliament. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah. And Philanthropy Australia are leading from the front, and so ACF, the organisation you run. So philanthropy is, put in a leadership position on this, and giving and money and philanthropy is going to play an important part, right?
Yeah, and this is the beauty of philanthropy. I mean, this is the power of giving, which is that you can get in behind, really incredibly important critical moments in time in our nation and globally and make a difference. And this is a really amazing example of many people giving together can make a difference to support something like this. So there are, like there is in any major political points of time. We have lots of public awareness going on out there about why this work is important and why this change will be important, and that needs to be supported with philanthropic dollars. So yes, so that's the work of the time. We're raising $1 million this year to support this work, and that's just a drop in the ocean of what's going to be needed.
Maree Sidey, a massive thank you for joining me on Purposely.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Purposely Podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review. I hope you like what you're hearing, because I sure do.